And you're using that time, I say, to collect some pilot data, publish and present, and all of these things are what strengthen your subsequent application for a PhD. And finally, to obtain funding and to use what you've developed during this time to obtain competitive funding from an organization, a charity, or an AHR, or similar to that. But what are the challenges of being an ACF? And I think the ACF is very much a bridge to a next step. It's not an endpoint itself. So when you're awarded an ACF, by itself, it's just a title, but it's what you actually spend using the time doing and using the opportunities doing. And the dropout rate is very high. So you imagine you're doing this alongside clinical practice. The first priority is clinical practice. And for many people who do an ACF, they don't go on to complete a higher degree. Finding the right research area and the right environment. So each university has a particular group of researchers who are interested in particular areas. And it's about finding that overlap with your own interest. Because if you're someone who's very interested in obstetrics and the university is much more well known for gynae research or vice versa, then you can find yourself in a group who perhaps don't fit with your own interests. As I said, balancing the clinical alongside research and your teaching commitments, it all adds pressure to what you're already doing. So in addition to doing the basic clinical work, you're also perhaps spending a lot of time outside of your normal working day, replying to emails, working up papers, involved in medical student teaching. You still need to obtain those same clinical skills and competencies in less time than your peers. So whereas the people that you'll be working with are having the full time, you're losing 25%. But the portfolio, your ARCP, what you're required to do to progress to your next stage of training is no different. So you're still needing to get all the bits of paper signed. And then, say most people pursuing PhDs. Most people pursuing PhDs won't have done academic training. So actually, you'll find that you're still competing with people who perhaps have been involved in projects alongside clinical work without having had the benefit of the academic training. And then finally, the PhD. So the aim of the ACF, of course, lengthens training. So typically it's taken as an out-of-program experience of 3 years. And this adds to the already 7 years training program. So it becomes a 10-year training program. So a little bit about what I spent my time doing. So during my ST1, I was in Barnet Hospital in North London. And then ST2 and 3, I'm at UCLH. So in the first 12 months, I took a 3-month block. At the end of ST1, it's really useful to get involved in the university more formally and spend time meeting more people. And we use this time to complete an application for a trial through the NIHR. I obtained some publications, some review articles with different supervisors. And then going into ST2, it was of course a little bit disrupted by COVID. So instead of a full 3-month block, I decided to take a 6-week block during a time that we were submitting another grant application to really focus and work on that, and then ad hoc days as needed throughout the year. Now that I'm beginning my ST3, I've instead decided that it would work better for me to take 1 day a week. I'm using this time to complete a postgraduate certificate in medical education, using the time to shape my potential PhD project and think about applying for funding in this round. So how do you apply to an ACF? So it opens earlier than the standard recruitment cycle. It's always advertised in Oriel, so you need to keep an eye on Oriel to see when application dates are. And it's a little different in that it's a locally run application recruitment cycle. So there's no going to Manchester or no sort of meeting on the same day and competing with ACFs across the country. It's very much run by the individual university. And it's a more traditional style of panel interview than perhaps we've become used to. There's no circuits or changing. And it's senior members of that university's academic staff asking different questions. It must be said that you must also be appointable and apply through the standard recruitment and benchmarked against your peers. So you must meet a minimum appointability through the standard recruitment process in order to be appointed to an ACF. So how are ACFs selected? And really what it comes down to is the panel are looking at, does this person have the potential and the motivation to be a future clinical academic? So they're looking for people who are likely to use this as a springboard to go on to completing their PhD. And for them, that's very important because the university is awarded places competitively, and the metric by which the university is assessed for future ACFs is, have their previous ACFs gone on to complete a PhD or an MD, a higher degree? And the currency of application really comes down to a few things. Obviously, research is very important. And the things that you'll be looking for on the panel are having done a BSc as an intercalated degree, perhaps having a master's or an MRes. Some people do that during their undergraduate degree. Most commonly, perhaps people would take it during or after foundation program. They're looking for papers, so publications that you've been involved in, perhaps in medical school or during foundation program. And presentations, so at conferences, abstracts, and such like. They're also looking for any prizes or awards you may have, sources of which are the Royal Society of Medicine. There's always the opportunity for an undergraduate essay each year. The RCOG have several different undergraduate and foundation prizes for either research or essays, elective prize, etc. And university prizes. So perhaps you've been awarded a first if you're intercalated, perhaps you've been awarded merits or distinctions throughout your university time. All of this is really valuable for applying. Similarly, teaching and leadership. So although less focused than perhaps the research and prize and awards, it's still important to demonstrate some involvement in teaching programs, leadership, perhaps in societies such as this society. And I wanted to really highlight there's no requirement to have done the academic foundation program. So as I said, academic training is very non-linear, and don't be put off if you're not someone who's already got in there from day one. It's still very much possible to apply. I didn't do an academic foundation program, and certainly there was no again, the academic foundation by itself is not something that they pick by. It's what you've done with that time and what you've achieved from it. And it also highlights really important to meet supervisors before applying. So although it's a very fair competitive progress, it's of course always useful to go and meet the people who would potentially be employing you to find out about the strengths of the university, about potential projects, and about what they're really looking for on a local level. I had a little look at the NIHR website about how the 2021 landscape for ACFs is looking, and I found that I think there are about 13 different ACFs around the country, and they're, as they all focused on teaching hospital university sites. It's important to remember some of them are themed, and by that I mean that some of them are particular to education. I think the UCL one this year isn't obs and gynae, but education focused. And similarly, sometimes they're mentioned as focused on a theme, so platform science or bioinformatics. And what this means that part of the application process will be awarded, part of the points will be awarded based on that particular element of the application. So for the education one, they'll be looking for someone who's got a research interest but stronger in the education. And the platform science and bioinformatics, they're looking at people who are using the technologies that come under that umbrella as part of their research project, or at least have an understanding of what those are. It's also important to remember that some of these positions are open to applicants from multiple specialties. For instance, some of them will be shared amongst obs and gynae, perhaps general surgery, vascular surgery. And again, they're taking the person who performs best from whichever specialty that may be. So what I've done is I've put the link to the NIHR, and this has got more information about it, about applying, about the process, and also about positions that are available for 2021. And I know that we have a Q&A afterwards, but I'm happy if anybody wants to email me. That's my address. It's z.nash@ucl.ac.uk. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach, for a really informative presentation. You've given us a really good overview of the whole academic application process. So I think a lot of people will be very grateful for that. And yeah, as you mentioned, we will be having another Q&A session after the next talk. So the codes will be sent on the Zoom group chat, and they're also available on our Facebook group as well. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Next up, we have Dr. Katie Kurt. Katie is currently an academic clinical fellow in obstetrics and gynecology and an ST3 at St. Thomas's Hospital, where her main research interests are in global women's health and preterm birth. She's coordinating a global health project in Bidibidi refugee settlement in Uganda, evaluating the use of the Cradle VSA device, which is a blood pressure and heart rate monitor developed to accurately measure vital signs in pregnant women in low-income settings. She also coordinated the VESPA study, which is Vital Signs Alert Evaluating Shock Index in Pregnancy Anemia, which was based in India. During her academic foundation program, she was the study coordinator for the EQUIP study, which was a multi-center parallel cluster randomized control trial to evaluate the QUIP app, which is something that she developed in the first iteration as part of her BSc project for the prediction of preterm birth in women. The QUIP app has gone on to win innovation awards from the Health Service Journal and King's College Entrepreneurship Institute. So I'm going to hand over to Katie. We're just going to coordinate on the slides, so bear with us.
Let me know when you're ready, Shabani.
Yeah, no problem.
Perfect.
Does that work, Katie?
Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to move.
You ready?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Shabini. My name's Katie, and thank you, Zach, for the for your presentation, because actually mine ties in terms of giving quite a personal experience of my own academic training so far, but definitely picks up on themes which Zach mentioned about his experience. So thank you. Next slide, Shabini. So first of all, Zach was mentioning about sort of things that you may or may not have done before you enter an academic training pathway. So I never really thought of myself as a kind of academic, but I did an intercalated BSc, mainly because it seemed to be what everyone was doing. I wasn't at a university where you had to. I studied at Barts in London, but I did a BSc in physiology and women's health at King's College London, and that's where I started on my first project, which was developing an app to predict preterm birth. I was lucky enough to be able to publish 3 papers from that work over the course of a few years, not during my BSc only, and that led me to think, well, actually, maybe this is interesting and something I'd like to continue. So Shabini, if you move on to the next slide, thank you. So then I did apply for an academic foundation program. I'd just like to agree with Zach here. An academic foundation program is not the be all and end all. It's a few months during your F2, which it was for me, where you can have some time dedicated to academic time. But actually, I don't think it's definitely not a necessity. But you know, I did a study here about running in pregnancy and the impact on birth weight and preterm birth. And that was obviously an interesting thing to do and gave me a little bit of breadth when it came to thinking about what I wanted to do next. So if you move on to the next slide, Shabini. Sorry, could you move on to the next slide? Thank you. And here again, I wanted to pick up on something that Zach mentioned. So this led to some quite careful consideration about where I wanted to apply for my ACF. I decided by this point that that was the route I wanted to take. And Zach mentioned something about this kind of working with the same group. And the year that I was ready to apply for my ACF, so going into my specialty training years, there actually wasn't an ACF available at Tommy's, which is where my group, where I'd started my research in preterm birth, was situated. And I thought about it and I thought, well, you know what, I'm just going to apply anyway. And I actually got an ACF at UCLH. And it was a really hard decision to actually say, you know what, I'm not going to go for that. I'm going to wait until the next year and stay with my group, because something about academic training is that you get this continuity of mentorship and the group where you've sort of developed an interest and started your work. And that's quite invaluable. And I find that in clinical medicine, you move through your firms so regularly that you don't actually build up established relationships with kind of experienced clinicians who are potentially very valuable mentors, you know, for many years of your training. So that led me to decide to take an F3, where I was a research fellow at King's College London with my preterm birth group. And I coordinated the EQUIP study, which was a randomized controlled trial to evaluate this app, which was by now in its second iteration, to predict preterm birth. And that gave some really sort of invaluable experience and insight into another aspect of academia, which is not just sitting there writing papers and analysing data. It's about organisation and administration of running your own project and coordinating your own study and the team and all the different kind of logistical aspects that involves. So it kind of opened my eyes up to all the other aspects of an academic career that I hadn't considered. So if you move on to the next slide, Shabini. And then I began to kind of develop an interest in global women's health, which my group at Tommy's was also very involved in. So my mentor, his interests are in preterm birth and also blood pressure monitoring in pregnancy. So he's developed this blood pressure device, which Shabini mentioned when she introduced me, which is about monitoring blood pressure in pregnant women. So since then, I've been working in Bidi Bidi refugee settlement in Uganda to evaluate this device in community health workers in that setting. So I think another thing to say about the academic training pathway is that you have time to see where your interests really lie and where you want to ultimately take your research career. So that went on into ST1. And during my ST1 year, I applied for the ACF that was that year available at Tommy's, where my research group was situated. So Shabini, if you move on to the next slide, thank you. So ST2 was my first year of official ACF at Tommy's. And that was rather kind of subdued by the fact that COVID hit. And whilst I was intending to spend my full block in Uganda, obviously I wasn't able to do that. But that brings me on to talk about another important component of your ACF, which is writing grant applications. Now, Zach mentioned that basically the point of an ACF is to develop a body of pilot work and to get funding to get a PhD post. So what you have to do is you have to get a post like this, and one way to do it is to get funding by writing a grant application. So you can apply to various funding boards and you can go with a project proposal, and if they think this is valuable and competitive and innovative, they will award you funding to carry it out. So that's an important thing to mention as a very integral part of your ACF training time. So that's what I've been mostly doing during my ACF block, which I've just finished, and I've just moved into my ST3. So if you could move on to the next slide, Shabini. So I wanted to sort of consolidate my experience into kind of good reasons to do an ACF. And I do feel I've find it a really valuable time. I find that it's something that's a very sort of diversifying aspect of my my career as a doctor. But sort of to summarize the main good points, I think time is really important. So the majority of consultants in London teaching hospitals have a higher degree these days. That's like a PhD or an MD. And so you're really expected to take quite an active role in quality improvement and research. And the thing is that an ACF actually gives time allocated to that. And you're sort of singled out to have opportunities to be involved in projects. And you're sometimes the first port of call amongst your colleagues to get involved in research projects that are going on, as well as being a part of your established research group, which by now you'll have probably built up. So that time for me is really important. And I mean, I'm not going to lie and say I don't spend a lot of time outside of my research block also working on papers and things like that. So it's not that you just do your research in your research time. but it does give you the specific allocated time where everyone expects you to be focusing on your research. Next one. So team. So I mentioned mentorship before, and I've had my mentor since I was doing my BSc, and we have a very he is really the person that's kind of guided me through not only my academic career, but also I would go to him for kind of clinical questions and challenges that I'm having, and I know that I can go to his office anytime, and I think that's a really sort of valuable thing to have in what we all know can be quite a challenging career at times. Also, though, sort of my wider team and colleagues, again, with our sort of transient training posts, we move through quickly, and it's more difficult to make sort of long-lasting friendships. But the academic side of things, you do spend more time with the people you're working with, I think, on the whole, has been my experience. And perhaps that seems like a kind of frivolous reference, but for me, that's, it's really important to have good support in your friends and colleagues. So that's been really valuable to me. Could you move on to the next one, please? Travel. So some people may not be interested in travel as part of their career, but I certainly am. Obviously I have a global health research interest, and which has taken me to all sorts of places mainly in East Africa, but also in Sierra Leone, where we have a large body of work going on. But also, going to conferences in Europe, sharing, your work with colleagues, and learning how things are done elsewhere is fascinating, and only kind of broadens the depth of your knowledge. And also you get to see beautiful places and towns and cities, which is a real boon, I think, in your career. So if you just move on to the next one. Also variety. So this might seem like such a kind of a slight abstract component, but the thing I find is that if some people will want to just climb the rungs of their clinical training, get to consultant as quickly as possible, and tick all the boxes, and that's fine and that's admirable, but it doesn't suit everybody. And for me, the academic training pathway gives you much more of an opportunity to customize your experience of your career, and play to your strengths, whatever those may be. So just an example of this, during COVID, obviously I was stuck in England when I'd hoped to be in Uganda, and I was writing a grant proposal, and you had the option to make a short film. So I thought that that's what I'd do. So I learned how to use iMovie, which is very straightforward. I'm sure lots of you use it. But I made a little film for this grant application, which my boss saw and asked me to make a film for him about transabdominal cerclage, which we've actually just had published in the American Journal of Obs and Gynae. One of my other mentors then asked me to make a film for her for the BMJ Awards, which we were shortlisted for, about PLGF testing, which is a test for detection of preeclampsia. And I really like drawing, so I was able to do a lot of drawing and kind of animations for those videos and put them together. So that's just really an example, a small example of how you can really tailor your career pathway a bit more in academia, I feel. And medicine's, as we all know, is a long haul, and as far as I'm concerned, the more variety you can bring to your career, the sort of more you're going to enjoy it, basically. And ultimately that's very important to be able to do it well. Move on to the next. I think that's the last one. So very happy if anyone has questions. If you want to contact me by email afterwards, that's fine. Sorry about the weird formatting of the email. But thanks for listening. I hope that was helpful and interesting to you all.
Thank you, Katie. That was really informative. You've spoken about lots of really interesting research that you've been involved in. I know that St. Thomas is quite a big centre as well. I was previously based there as well, so it's a great place to work. Thank you for telling us a lot about everything going on there. So I'm going to now hand over to Jack, our media officer, who's going to be coordinating some questions. I'm aware that we're running a little bit behind schedule, but we are really grateful for all of the presentations today. So do bear with us, and we'll be moving on to the F3 segment soon after that. So Jack, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have our first question. These two go hand in hand. So how do you get involved in research without doing academic training pathway?
Can any of us answer, or do you want?
So I'll give it to Zach, and then Katie, you can answer after, and then we can swap array around.
Sure.
I think opportunities come at lots of different times. So, you know, starting with medical school, perhaps, an SSC, or perhaps, you know, you meet somebody who's inspirational clinically when you're on a placement and you find about their research. And just looking online at your medical school website, you know, you'll find people, and you can always just email them speculatively and just say you're interested and have a chat with them. I think people are always sort of looking, academics are always looking for people to get involved.
Sorry, Zach, I'll just add, is there anything in particular for foundation doctors who the majority of our audience are more foundation doctors as well? Is it sort of the same kind of thing that you would, you know, think for them to look for?
So very much the same, you know, opportunities in departments, particularly if you're fortunate to be in an academic department in a teaching hospital, then certainly just go and talk to them.
Katie?
Yeah, so I think it's actually, to be honest, if you're keen and interested, I think it's actually quite easy to get involved in research. And, you know, there'll often be, for example, audit opportunities. So if you did a really good audit and then you went to the person who was in charge of that audit and said, you know what, I'm really interested to do a bit more, then, you know, they might give you something else, and you sort of establish a bit of a relationship. And, you know, if you, as it was said, if you are in a teaching hospital, there will be, you know, the higher level clinicians will probably be involved in research. So I don't think it's a, you know, it's not totally necessary to be on the official academic training pathway. And I have a number of colleagues who have actually come in, you know, having really very, very limited or no research experience, and having basically gone straight into a PhD because an opportunity has arisen where there's been funding secured already.
I think this follows up with the next question about, can you take time out to do a PhD and research without being an ACF?
Absolutely. So the majority of people who do research will not have done the ACF. The majority of people will, as Katie says, you know, a department will have some money. It may be advertised, or it may be that they're trying to recruit somebody. It's not a case that you have to do the ACF at all.
Thank you. So the next question is about finding the balance between completing competencies for O&G training with the academic responsibility. The question is it manageable? So I hand it over you to Zach first.
It's definitely manageable, but it's an extra challenge that requires you to manage your time and perhaps you know, just use your time as effectively as possible. Obs and Gynae is a skill-based specialty, and it does take time to develop competencies. But I think if you manage your time well and commit yourself, particularly the clinical side, but then equally keep your research time sort of ring-fenced and not let the clinical work encroach on that, you will have to do some work outside of your normal working day. Of course, you'll be working hard some evenings, weekends, but it's very manageable.
Katie?
I think just to add to that, you know, Obs and Gynae, you have enough on calls, and you know, your rota, even as an academic trainee, provides sufficient opportunity, particularly if you're working at a busy hospital, to get all your sign-offs. And I think, as Zach said, it's just about being quite organised. And so what I try to do at the beginning of each training year is get the matrix of exactly what clinical competencies I need to achieve at the beginning of each training year, and sort of make sure that I'm well aware of exactly what I need to do, and then just systematically work through it. And as long as you're organised and don't sort of just bury it in the sand and leave it till the last minute and get too involved in your academic work and ignore the clinical side, then you'll be fine. I think it's totally achievable.
Thank you very much. I think the next question is around the application side of things. So the questions were, is ACF competitive, especially if you don't have any publications? Can you apply to more than one ACF hospital? And a bit about the interview process. They want to know a bit of details of what does it involve. Maybe you can split into half and half. So Katie, you first.
So the application process, as Zach mentioned, it opened slightly earlier, and well, when I did it, unless they've changed it, which I don't think they have, you have to fill in some white space questions, which are fairly straightforward questions that you'd expect, sort of personal statement type questions. And then they will potentially invite you to an interview. As was mentioned, the structure of the interview is quite different from your clinical training interview. So you'll sit in front of a panel, which I guess could be thought of as a little bit intimidating, but they're not out to get you. They're I had 2 interviews and they were very friendly, but it's a slightly different format. So you get given an abstract, a scientific abstract, and you get about 10 minutes to have a look at it. And then they ask you about it in the interview. That's the first thing they do. And they ask you to give a kind of lay summary of it as far as you understand it. And then they ask you to sort of summarize the clinical findings to a bunch of medical colleagues. And then they go on and they ask you about your white space answers that you've given. And there is a very useful guidance document. I think it's in PDF format. You can print it off the NIHR website, specifically related to ACF applications. And I recommend that anyone interested prints it off and gets a very good understanding of that document, because they tell you basically what they're going to ask you about in that document. And in my interview, they were true to form and they stuck to that format. The other thing that I realized shortly before my interview was that at the back of that document, there was an appendix with quite a sort of detailed kind of set of information that they wanted to see, and that was very useful in the interview as well. So I just say get that document and make sure that you're very familiar with it. I'll hand over to Zach now. Probably taking up too much time.
No, not at all.
So just to recap, so the questions there were 3. So I think Katie just answered the third one. There's one about how competitive, and then there was one, the first question.
Without public, can you without publications, and can you apply to more than one ACF hospital?
Yes, so you can apply to as many as you like, but I suppose you have to think about the merits of that, because as Katie said, you're perhaps thinking about where's the best fit for you. You're thinking about the department. So I don't think it's a very focused approach, because if you go in with a sort of shotgun approach, you're not going to be giving your best to that individual department, I think, as an applicant. In terms of competitiveness and do you need publications, so I think it's very variable. Because there's only one position, it's very much who applies that year. I'm thinking about my 2 predecessors at UCLH. One had a PhD, and clearly he had a very strong CV, and then the person who came after me, much like myself, didn't have a PhD. So it's very much dependent on who applies that year for competitiveness. And about having publications, I think publications will set you apart. Publications will very much help your cause. They're not completely necessary, but I think that if you don't have any publications, then you'll perhaps be putting yourself at a disadvantage. I think if you can, then finding a way to get one would definitely help your application.
Thank you very much for both our speakers. I'll just hand it over to Shabini now.
Thanks again, Zach and Katie. Both those presentations are really useful, and they touched on different aspects, I think, with the process, and some really good insider tips as well. So thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next segment now, which is going to be our 2 F3 doctors. So last but surely not least at all, we've got Dr. Emily Sanders. So Emily is a current junior clinical fellow at Queen Charlotte's. as part of the Imperial NHS Trust. She started in August 2020 after completing her foundation years. She's a graduate of the University of Manchester and completed her FY1 year at Kettering, including 4 months on Obs and Gynae, and then her F2 in Leicester. She's been interested in Obs and Gynae since the 4th year of uni. Her heart was set after having a baby named after herself, and she's been committed to the specialty ever since. She chose to do an F3 year and did not apply for a specialty training post, since she had several interests outside of medicine that she wanted time to develop, and is really glad that she did so. So I'm going to hand over to Emily now, who's going to give us her presentation.
Brilliant, thanks Shamini.
No worries.
Okay, so welcome. Thank you very much for coming to the talk, and I hope everybody's still awake. So I'm here to talk about why you should definitely take an F3 year. And I think this is particularly relevant during COVID, as there are a lot of restrictions on what you can and can't do at the moment. So an F3 is a really, really good option that you should seriously consider. So an F3 year is an informal title for basically that's anything outside of natural training. You can do it for so many different reasons. Some people do it because of personal commitments, you know, maybe they're getting married or having a baby, or there's a family member that's unwell, but other people do it for different reasons. So it can be a good opportunity to try different specialities. If you're in between two, you can try them both. Maybe you didn't get an Obs and Gynae job in your foundation year, so then doing an F3 would give you the opportunity to try it for yourself. It's a really good opportunity to enhance your portfolio. So as they were saying in the academic talk, it's good to get some research and publications under your belt before you apply further, just to sort of give you that extra boost. So you can focus an F3 year on how you can get those publications, or maybe you want to do some teaching and get that extra box ticked, you know, it's up to you. But basically it's a really good year that you can do to choose to enhance your portfolio. It's also a good opportunity to do exams, maybe with a bit more clinical experience in the field, or if you take a year outside of medicine, you have more time to yourself and more time to study. Other reasons why people do an F3 year is just for personal growth. So they want to do things outside of medicine, they have businesses alongside. Basically, it's now becoming so much more common to do an F3 year than it is to go straight from specialty training to go straight from foundation training to specialty training, sorry. So in 2011, 71% of people went straight from foundation training to specialty, whereas in 2018 it was only 37%, and I reckon that percentage is even smaller, and I'm sure most of you know people that are currently on F3 years. And even if you have an F3, F4, F5 years, people generally call it an F3. It's, like I said, it's a year outside of medicine. So you can do so much as an F3. It's basically up to you. So you can do a fellowship, which is just London's version of a trust grade post, which is what I'm doing. You can take the time to locum, you can do research, you can do teaching, or like I said, have a year outside of medicine. What I've put there is that it needs to be justifiable. So what I mean is, for your career down the line, you have to explain what you've done with your time. So the usual linear program is from foundation year to specialty training. But if you don't follow that linear program, you have to be able to talk about why. Even if it is, I took an F3 year out so I could spend more time with my family. You've got a reason. Nobody can dismiss you for that. You just need to be able to give that reason, not just, I applied for a specialty, I didn't get in, so I took an F3. That doesn't count. You have to organise it and, choose to do it, really. So a bit more on locuming. So there are lots of pros and cons to locuming. Focusing on the pros first, so there's geographical certainty. So what I mean by that is you can pick where you locum. If you want to stay in London the whole time, you can just find jobs in London. If you want to go up to Scotland, you can do, it's up to you. In this, you have control over your hours. If you never want to do a night shift, you don't have to. You don't have to work Christmas, you don't have to work your birthday. You have that flexibility and control. Other pros of locuming are that you don't have to do audits and quips and projects and stuff. If you want to just turn up, do the work and go home, you can do. That's absolutely fine. One of the main pulls for locuming is the money. So depending on where you go, you can earn from £35 to £70 an hour as an SHO, higher if you're a registrar or trained at that level. depending on whether you're doing day shifts or night shifts and where you are. And one of the other main advantages of locuming is that you don't de-skill. So even though you're not on a training program for a year, you're still doing bloods, catheters, cannulas, whatever during that time, so you won't de-skill and you still retain that knowledge. Cons of locuming is it can be disjointed. So if you're picking up random shifts, you're not necessarily in the same hospital or department, you're not making those connections, you're not necessarily getting used to how things go in that hospital. So that can be a bit clunky. Like I said, you don't have to get involved with audits, quips and stuff like that, but then you don't have them on your portfolio. So if you choose to locum in the same place or at the same time, then maybe you will. But locuming, you don't necessarily get that. I mean, the UK is undersubscribed in its doctors, so that, we always do need doctors. However, you won't necessarily find that there will always be an obs and gynae post coming up on locum, because in London, you might find that there's a random stroke post or a respiratory post or a surgery post, or there's obs and gynae ones different around the country. So if you're too focused with your locuming, then you won't necessarily find the speciality or the shift that you want. Opinions. So, some older clinicians used to have a negative view on locuming. It was just more that that's something that people do for the money, which isn't true. But those opinions do still float around and you will come across them. Mostly people just accept that that's something that people do now to enhance their CV, but some people do have a negative view of it still, and you do need to be aware of that. And then if you're locuming in London, there's a cap. So because there's such a high density of hospitals in the area, they have this flat rate so that the hospitals can't out-compete each other. So at the moment, for a 9 to 5 shift in London, it's £35 and 3 pence an hour or something like that for every single speciality, and for night shifts it goes up to 43. So that's still good money, but elsewhere outside of London you can earn a lot more. So my plan was to do 6 months on obs and gynae and then 6 months locuming and holidays. I wanted to do obs and gynae first because I want to apply this time for ST1 application. And I thought it would be a really good opportunity to get a few more audits and quips under my belt. So because I did it as an F1, I do have a couple of things in my portfolio, but I wanted a few more so that I could have a better chance of getting the track and the area that I want when I apply. It's a really good opportunity to boost my portfolio and make connections, and really to learn more about the speciality. So as an F1, it was brilliant for sort of watching and observing what consultants do, what registrars do, what SHOs do, but it's not really appropriate necessarily as an F1 for you to get as stuck in as you do as an SHO. So now I'm on the SHO rota, I'm getting more involved with surgery, seeing my own patients, and it's really improving my confidence so that I know that when I do get to start as an ST1, I'm not completely brand new, rabbit in the headlights kind of thing. I have that experience and I have that confidence. And for me, it was a really good opportunity to sit the Part 1 exam. So my original plan was to sit it in July, but then with COVID, it all got pushed back to September. It did help because it meant that I had some clinical experience before sitting the exam, but in July, it would have been a good opportunity and motivation to approach the speciality with some knowledge. But yeah, lots of people do sit the exam in their F3 year. And then, locuming and holidays, I'll be honest, I need the money. I want to get married. I want to have a house. So locuming, like I said, is a really good opportunity for the money involved. And then holidays. So I think we've spoken quite a lot already about traveling. And yes, you can absolutely do that with work, but you don't necessarily want to go to places and work all the time. So particularly at the moment when you come back and you have to isolate for 2 weeks, if you're locuming and you're in control of your schedule, you're not affected by an annual leave restriction. You can go to wherever you want for however long you want. And then if you have to come back and quarantine for 2 weeks, you can. You do have to be mindful that in those 2 weeks and obviously on the holiday, you're not locuming, so you lose out on money at that point, but it's less restrictive. You can still go and come back and you're not tied to a rota. yeah, otherwise you have time for hobbies, things outside of medicine, and just it's nice to not be on a strict pathway. For me, I've never taken a year out, so this was a really good opportunity just to get off the treadmill and just have a bit of a relax. So a bit more about Junior Clinical Fellow. So like I said, this is London's version of a trust grade. There's nothing different, it's just a title. So I am on the SHO rota at the same as all the ST1s and ST2s. I'm just filling a gap in the rota. I am not guaranteed teaching, so it's very strongly encouraged for me to go to teaching. However, if like the DAU or the assessment unit is busy, it's the ST1s and 2s that get the priority to go to the teaching, and then for me to sort out the department and then go to the teaching afterwards. It's a fixed term post, so it's for 6 months. Some trusts you will find that they have the option of extending. However, these are really competitive and popular, so it's not always possible to just extend them. Yeah, as I keep saying, I'm on the SHO on-call rota, and it's a standard salary, so I'm paid the exact same that I was paid as an F2, including the London waiting. So yeah, it's not necessarily a competitive salary, but the perks and the aspects that you get of being involved in obs and gynae and being able to do the projects kind of outweigh that. Things that I do day to day is very, very varied, as obs and gynae is. So antenatal clinics and gynae clinics, standard. C-sections, emergency and elective. So emergency ones, I'm definitely always assisting, but with the elective ones, the training list at Queen Charlotte, so they're slowly getting me to do more and more in the surgery, which should stand me in good stead for when I start. Like I said, it all goes back to confidence and being able to do more. Getting involved with deliveries, seeing pregnant patients at different stages. It's just basically all obs and gynae. That's what I'm doing. So my past month has been pretty busy. So on Monday, the 28th, was the part 1 exam, still waiting results. I then had study leave after the exam, which looked a bit suspicious, but it was because I had an essay due from something that I was doing in Leicester the following Friday. Now, I missed the first parts of the talk, so I'm not sure whether anybody's clarified, but in London, the changeover date is in October rather than August. So all the new trainees in London started this Wednesday, just gone. As you can see, I'm on call quite a lot. My day goes from 8 till 5:30 most of the time. And yeah, it's very varied. You get to do a lot. It's really good. So my top tips for an F3 year: please don't see it as the year that you have to do if you don't get in. Actively organise your year, look early, plan ahead, but at the same time be flexible, particularly if you're locuming. If you can't locum in obs and gynae, still locum, get the experience of medicine, because you need that for maternal medicine in pregnancy, and for gynecology, get the experience in neonates, because they're babies, you need them. It's a really good opportunity to try different specialities. So if you're between 2 specialities, try them both. And obs and gynae is the speciality with the highest dropout rate, so it's really important that you're sure before you apply. So use this year to make sure that you're sure. Practice your interviews. So generally the interviews aren't as difficult, it's not quite the right word, but they're not as taxing as the speciality interviews, so I'm told. So they are very useful for practice for the speciality, but you do still need to prepare for them. So make sure you CV and your portfolio is up to date, and practice with friends and family. And then use the year to spend some time with friends and family. If you're not on a set rota, you have more time to yourself and you can do whatever you want with that. That's my email. Please feel free to email me with any questions, comments, whatever, I don't mind, and I will be part of the Q&A session at the end. I hope this has been useful. I'm sorry if I've rambled, but yeah, enjoy.
Not at all, Emily, that was really useful. Thank you for that talk. And yeah, she's going to be online after the second talk as well. So we've got another event code for F3 questions if you've got any for our 2 speakers. So I think I've posted it on the group chat there on the side. So it's #69012. So do keep them coming through on Slido and we can answer them all soon after our last speaker's talk now. So our final speaker, who's been waiting quite patiently, is Dr. Anasia Vasikuran. She's going to be also sharing her experiences of an F3 year. And a big thank you in advance for her for joining us today. She's just finished a shift on call as well. So as I said, Anasia is currently on her F3 year. She studied at King's College London, where she also did an intercalated degree in women's health. She then went on to complete her foundation training in the North West London Deanery, which included a rotation in obstetrics and gynecology, which confirmed her interest in the specialty. She's currently working as a clinical fellow in the obstetrics and gynecology department at UCLH. Working there has provided her with a great opportunity to experience multiple subspecialties within O&G and has allowed her to broaden her interest, particularly in early pregnancy, fertility, and fetal medicine. Over to you, Anasia.
Great, thanks, Shirini. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great, and we can see your screen.
Fantastic. Hi everyone, my name's Anasia. So I am currently doing my F3 year in Obs and Gynae at UCLH. I know Emily's probably covered a lot about taking an F3, so I won't spend too much time talking about it, and I'll focus a little bit more on sort of my personal experience. But just to sort of reiterate, an F3 is just a year out that you can take after you've done your F1 and your F2 training. So I finished my F2 in August. It's becoming a lot more popular now. The majority of people actually do opt to take an F3, and it's a fantastic opportunity if you are interested in doing it. So Emily's already gone through this in detail, so I won't spend too long on this. But so essentially, there's lots of different reasons for taking an F3 year. For me personally, I thought it would be a great opportunity to build my portfolio. You get lots of opportunities to do lots of extra audits, research, things like that. If you have sort of other out of work commitments, it's a useful time to sort of put more time into those. You can work on your own time. It's flexible, which is quite different to, you know, your F1, F2 and working as a trainee. Especially with courses like Obs and Gynae, where it is run through training. It's quite useful to take a year out just to avoid burnout, especially for example, for me, I went from medical school straight into foundation training. And from school into medical school, so I never really took any time out. And for me, this year is essentially just a year out in between, and it's a nice opportunity just to make sure that you can take some time for yourself and work at your own pace. If you're unsure about which specialties to apply for, or there are other specialties that you're interested in, it's quite a good opportunity to explore that as well. And ultimately, there's not really much of you're not at a disadvantage from taking a year out before you go into training. If anything, you've got more time to build up your portfolio. So like Emily's already said, there's lots of different options. You can do sort of locum work if you want, or you can do sort of what myself and Emily are doing, which is a clinical fellow or a trust grade job. You can go into teaching, you can go into research, you can even work abroad if you want to. Australia is quite a popular place that people tend to go to work, and you can get involved in voluntary work as well. So a little bit about me and sort of my journey so far. So I graduated from King's, and I did do an intercalated degree there in women's health as well. And I was in North West London for my training, which I finished in foundation training, which I finished in August. I did do an F2 rotation in Obs and Gynae. I would add that I think if you are, depending on what stage you're at, but if you're sort of at medical school and you're thinking about what kind of jobs you want to do in your foundation training, it is quite, if you are interested in Obs and Gynae or any specialty, it's quite good to do it as an F2. Just because I think because you're on the SHO rota, it means that you get quite a realistic idea of what it's like. In Obs and Gynae, when you do it as an F1, because you're not on the on-call rota, sometimes some people can find that they maybe lose interest in it, and actually doing it as an F1 might not be the most accurate representation of it. So it's good to do it as an F2. Conversely, if you've done it as an F1, it gives you plenty of time to work on audits and things and build up your portfolio if you know you're interested in it. But if you're unsure, it's quite good to do it in F2 just to get a realistic idea of the job. So my plan for my F3 year was basically the same as Emily's, to split it into 6 months. So the first 6 months I'm working at UCLH. Essentially, it's just to sort of get more opportunities to do audit and research and things like that, and just build on my clinical experience. And I'm on the SHO on-call rota here as well, so you work exactly the same as the trainees. The rota here doesn't really favour anybody in particular, so you still get the same amount of clinical experience, which is good. It's a great opportunity to meet other trainees as well and get help with your application and things like that. And then the remaining 6 months, I mean, the plan is to travel if possible. And it's also a good opportunity to sort of locum in other specialties as well, if you want to just improve your clinical skills in general. And then just talking about the job specifically at UCLH, so UCLH is a very, very big department, and it's got loads of different subspecialties here that you might not see in a DGH, which is where I did my F2 training. So it was quite an interesting experience working in a place like UCLH. But they've got gynae oncology, which is really interesting, lots of long but very interesting operations. They've got a really good fetal medicine unit here. They do reproductive medicine and urogynae as well. And they've got a very, very good gynae ultrasound and early pregnancy unit, which is quite very well known. And you get lots of opportunities to go there and observe scanning and things like that. We do get departmental teaching every week as well, and you're on, like I said, you're on call rota, and it's a huge team. So there's 18 SHOs that all work together. So it's quite good because everyone gets equal opportunities to do a lot of different things. And then this is just sort of just a glance at like a typical timetable. This is pretty much the same that you're going to get wherever you do obs and gynae. But there is a little bit more specialist stuff if you do it at tertiary centres like UCLH. Just things like antenatal and postnatal wards, that's stuff that you will do wherever you are. Gynae on call, so that just involves seeing patients in A&E and looking after the ward patients, and then going to theatre. There could be general gynae, could be gynae oncology. Elective C-sections, and here it's usually you and one consultant, so it's a really good learning opportunity. You get to practice a lot of your surgical skills, you get to do a few of the sections yourself, which is great. And then you also get time on the labour ward and obstetric on calls, where you'll cover triage, which is essentially pregnant A&E. And then you may occasionally get some special interest days where you can go to any of those subspecialties that I mentioned, go to their clinics, go to their theatre lists, etc. So in terms of just general tips, I think an F3 is useful if you know that you're going to make use of it. What I mean by that is, I think there is a lot of people do take an F3 because they like the idea of it, but it's important to make it productive no matter what it is you do. It doesn't have to be anything academic, as long as you do something with your F3 year, like Emily already said. Also make sure that you just look for jobs early. Generally the F3 jobs start coming out around January time. So they are, especially the clinical fellow sort of trust grade jobs can be a bit competitive if you want to work in London and things like that. So start applying for them early, so you make sure you've got sort of a plan for your year. If you want to use it to build up your portfolio, and then obviously enjoy it. That's the most important thing. And that's it.
Great.
Oh, and there's an email if you want it. There we go.
Great, thank you, Anastasia. Thank you for that presentation. Incredibly useful. As I was saying, both yours and Emily's F3s were similar, but you've both touched on really different points there. So I think that'll give our viewers a lot of information. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have a Q&A session with both of you. This is going to be led by Anna, who's the BUSOG president. So I'll hand over to you, Anna.
Hi everyone. So we've got a few questions that have come through for you both. So our top one that we've got is, do you think you should disclose at interview if you're doing an F3 due to failing to get an ST1 post? So Emily, did you want to weigh in?
No, it's absolutely fine. You don't have, it doesn't make a difference whether you've chosen to do this instead of an ST1 post or you've not got the ST1 post. Nobody really needs to know. It's completely up to you.
I agree. I don't think there's any reason why you need to tell them that. And that's just, you know, I think there's no requirement that you need to tell them that, you know, that's the reason you're doing an F3. So it's really up to you.
Cool, thanks. So there's a couple of questions which I think you touched on just towards the end of your talk, is how early should you sort of start looking for F3 posts? And I know you said sort of like you need to start looking for them quite early, but is that like F1 or?
So I mean I started looking in F2. So essentially the jobs for the August of that year will usually come out early on in the very same year. So probably not F1, but in F2 you can start applying. And as far as I'm aware, most of them from where I applied came out in January. I don't know if Emily feels any different, but that's the general time they tend to come out.
I just wondered as well, would you be able to tell us where specifically people can find the jobs? Because it'll be different to, you know, Oriel or anything else that people use.
Yeah, so most of the jobs come up on NHS jobs. So you can either use that or something like Indeed or even LinkedIn. I also looked in F2. I didn't look in F1 because, you know, you have to do your F2 you have to do your F2 year. You can't apply at the end of F1. But in the sort of September, October time, I was looking at what kind of things I could do because I knew that I definitely wanted to do an F3. And I saw a lot of posts were being advertised for February, like starting for February till August. So I emailed the people who were doing those posts and said, you know, will this post be available in August? If so, can I apply now? It was like 50-50 whether people got back to me and said, yep, brilliant, well organised, you can apply now, or no, you have to apply in February with everybody else. So NHS jobs, Indeed, you can look sort of at the beginning of F2. I wouldn't really look any earlier than that though.
And I think kind of following on from that is another question. Can you apply for a training number and trust grade?
Yeah, you can. You can apply for as many things as you want. You don't have to disclose how many things that you're applying for or what else you're applying for. You can apply for things in the UK, you can apply for things in Australia, New Zealand. You can apply for whatever you want.
Okay. And I think this is a question that came through in your talk, Emily. When you the Horus e-portfolio from Foundation, and kind of following on from that, how competitive did you feel it was to get your O&G fellow job?
So it depends. So where I do it in Imperial, they have a specific F3 program. So you can do it in obs-and-gynae, anesthetics, cardiology, whatever, but they have a specific program because a lot of places are starting to develop these as F3s are becoming more common. I didn't meet anybody else that was applying at the same time as me. Maybe it was because I was applying in the October for the following August, whereas most people were applying for the February. But I think it is becoming more competitive as more people are becoming aware that it is something that you can apply for. But the honest answer is that I have no idea how many people I was up against or how competitive the specific jobs are. Generally not as competitive as ST1 applications, but yeah, I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful.
No, I guess it's probably more challenging to tell because it's like individual trusts that advertise and administer the roles rather than like a nationalized thing where they'll probably give you the competition ratios every year for the kind of national training numbers. And in terms of the portfolio that you mentioned, is that the Foundation Horus e-portfolio?
Yeah, so you have to, well, it's changed now because the interviews are now online and via Zoom or whatever team platform thing they're using. But you used to have to present like an actual physical file of portfolio that showed all the audits you'd been involved with, all the research, or any certificates and stuff. So whenever you're applying for any job, whether it's an Obs and Gynae ST1 application or a trust grade fellow, you'll see that there's a person specification. So I would always tailor my portfolio, whether that's online via Horus or my physical portfolio, so that I tick all the boxes on that person specification. So it's more, you know, making sure that your application fills exactly what they're looking for, whether it's a physical one, you can do it via Horus, or there's quite a few online e-portfolios that you can use, and different locum agencies I've noticed recommend different ones. But yeah, most people still use Horus.
Okay, this is the last question before we wrap up, and I guess this is kind of more of a personal opinion rather than I think something solid, but someone's asked, how disadvantaged would you be when applying this year if you didn't do an F3 year to gain extra experience in Obs and Gynae? So yeah, I guess like how advantageous do you think an F3 year will be towards your eventual training post applications?
I think the only difference with when you take an F3 is that essentially you have the rest of your F2 year to start to build up your application, which if you're applying at the start of your F2 year is essentially what you might not get opportunity to do, because the actual applications open essentially very soon at the end of this month. So getting much done in your actual F3 year, you've only really got about 2 to 3 months, which you could use to build up if you want. It's just that you've got the added advantage is time. But also Obs and Gynae, unlike other specialties, is not as, there's no sort of physical portfolio, and therefore in terms of, it's not as sort of tick boxy as like, you know, applying for surgical training and things like that. So I don't think people should be worried too much about trying to get loads and loads of things done. I think as long as you've shown evidence that you've done the things, like Emily said, that are in the person specification, you've got examples to show them. It doesn't really matter the number of things you've done, as long as you've just done the relevant things. And if you've been sort of proactive in your foundation years, then that should be enough. And F3 just gives you a little bit more time, I guess, if you feel that you need it.
That's great, thank you. Emily, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't. I think you're not at a disadvantage for doing an F3. You know, you can network a bit more if you're working in a hospital in Obs and Gynae, which you don't necessarily get if you're not doing it as an F1 or as an F2. And it depends, as long as you can talk about, you know, have you had any roles in teaching? Yes, I did lectures for medical students or bedside teaching. That's all you have to do. You don't have to have a PG cert in education. You just have to sort of be able to talk around your answers. So you're not at a disadvantage if you don't do an F3, but equally it does give you more opportunity to use the rest of your F2 year to tailor your application.
That's great. Well, that's our last question and last question of the entire event. So I'll hand back to Shabini to wrap up. And thank you guys so much for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Anasia. Yeah, so that's the end of our event today. I just want to highlight a few things. So we've put some feedback form links for everyone, both on Facebook, but also just in the Zoom chat here. So we'd really appreciate it if you guys could all give a bit of feedback about how you thought the event went, how you thought the event went. You know, any comments are welcome. A massive thank you to all our speakers. We've had quite an array over the whole event, so we are really grateful from the BUSOG team and all our members as well. We are looking to get recordings of the whole event out as soon as possible. We just are awaiting, the consent of all of our speakers, so that will probably be in the next week or so. So keep an eye on our social media for that. We'll keep you all posted. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Just one last promotion. We've got another event tomorrow run by our event team. There's a webinar that they're doing. I think it's around about 6 o'clock in the evening, and it's to do with O&G and primary care. So I think there's quite a lot of interest. So if you're not already aware, do try and join in. We look forward to seeing you all soon. So that's thank you from us. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.